just going.
We can find out.
It's posted though. It's posted. It's the same there. She told me that it's posted. And they changed the website too. They know I'm trying to find the website.
He don't want. It's different. It's different. So I don't think how much it was. Ryan, no, you. He didn't get the message.
Marissa, you're gonna talk to me outside. Chill.
He don't have it. Okay. He don't have it. It was like wasn't good because she was scoring me
I checked something.
because how can you explain it was all over comments? How do you tell me by month that I'm an excellent employee and how it's for like a team, but then you score me low, because you score me low, because you score me big, sometimes I should have been questions and I was not trained to.
You switched too.
I switched up. I didn't stop until September.
And I started to like just feel you there because I thought you just stuck it at you found.
So it was like
You just dinged out, you get dinged out at 5 o'clock in the morning when everybody's still
But I ain't get no ding, no. And I just locked myself up. You tell me when time is it? It ain't on the website to request the password.
home with me
I'm
because I
so
So
sorry.
yeah, when I
When you forget your password, they don't have that there on the
oh you remember your password? I think there's something that on there to reset your password. There is something to reset your password because I've done it before.
Yeah, probably they show up on
maybe they
Yeah, you see the mobile version of the famous PC version.
I see you can be making it because customers are actually what's funny is that a lot of this
so I don't decide.
customer service is not good. So Jamaican people do all of this stuff that I used to do before. So when they have one person do it, now they have two people do it. So I guess it but
My final, okay.
what really
I've been in class so long, you forget your password.
I changed it though. But the things I put it wrong. They tell me wait 5 minutes.
Yeah, they probably, yeah, before they start send you an email and a temporary one.
Everything that every person Malcolm I do is always something different ish.
I'm sorry,
It's always something different and I'm like
and she was like, I can hear it in your voice.
yeah.
So, really good education there. Yeah. I didn't have your name. Marissa got the email and she texted me on the morning. I was driving to work.
I think she
And she texted me and I had to stop there next week and I can be right now. And I get to work. I get to work.
but you want your version of the trial. The office to answer queries, to deal with any homework, to do clerical work, because you don't realize the chances you want to all your risk ratings that you want to do, all the application stuff that you want to do, and but you want the person to be out on the road. No. But I did tell her to just emergency. That was like a session on Tuesday. I was like 3 hours out. No, more lunch break.
I don't need it.
She said, no, I know that, but I know she
Woof.
2 months ago.
Where you at now?
Now I'm taking my own grandmother.
Yeah, Elena.
Helena in compliance, but
Yeah, yeah, check I'm lying, yeah.
So you're paying you more there.
That's not good.
not yet.
Yeah, this is the front. The back is the one.
Okay, good evening, everyone. Good evening. Good to see y'all. I know y'all had a very long break. I was giving you a moment or two to do a little bit of kind of reunion kind of thing. Y'all hadn't seen each other since what, March?
March.
Yeah, that's been a long time, so just want to give you a chance to catch up. What we will do, we'll proceed, and anybody else coming behind will join us. But how y'all doing? Everybody
Must be all in all.
holding on
We're just hanging on.
We hanging on.
Hanging on.
by a piece of
Yeah.
thread.
Don't see the cells, let it rest.
I was hoping you would have been doing better than that, but that's okay. We'll proceed. You're on the home stretch. Let me say to all of you, thank you very much for coming back. Let me also say, in starting out, that you must be the praying group. Um, why I said that is persons have taken this course over and over and over again with the Institute, and more so than the big binder, good evening, more so than who was teaching, more so than anything else, people feared that final exam. And so I say you must really be a praying people. How's it going so far though? Assignments, everything is okay?
Last one to do.
Let's okay, what we will do, we'll proceed in this manner. This evening we will go through first of all, we'll backtrack, good evening, and give you, no, that's not, the roster is going somewhere around, right? We'll backtrack and give you a brief overview and just sort of remind you of this whole GRC subject matter. After which we'll look at a couple of the case studies this evening. After which we will just perhaps wrap up early this evening, and what I propose to do, we have 3 evenings together. We will go through a couple of the case studies this evening. We'll go through the rest of them next time we meet, and the third time we'll be committed totally to going through the assignment. Is that okay? What I want to do, I want to perhaps help you, guide you through navigating that assignment, and so we'll commit some time to that. I think it will not be in the best interest, in your best interest, or the best use of time to continue to go through the material and all of that. We can do that sometime next week, bring it all together, after which we will spend a great deal of time going through the assignment. How many of you have, would you say that you read the assignment and you are kind of okay with it at this point? I mean, I know you haven't committed all the time you needed, but you're okay with the assignment now. Let me put that another way. Should we commit an entire evening to the assignment?
Yes.
Okay, we will do that. That will be our 3rd evening together. In fact, perhaps we will start maybe nearing the end of next week. Meaning we will try to get these case studies out of the way, after which we will commit some time to the assignment. But having said that, let us step back a bit and look at this whole business of governance, risk, and compliance. As I said, some of you haven't been here for quite some time, so let us sort of remind you what this whole thing was about. We will talk a bit about GRC, governance, risk, and compliance. We'll have a brief overview of the case for centralizing the GRC. We will look at the case on Lehman Brothers. We look at the case on Royal Bank of Scotland. And then we will, if we have time, we perhaps may look at the one on cooperatives. And then we will wrap up for the evening. And so let us remember this whole thing of GRC. Let us give some thought to that for a couple of minutes. GRC, I know you've had a long break, and so let us sort of refresh you with what GRC is. Obviously, the G stands for governance, the R stands for risk, and the C is compliance. When we speak of GRC, compliance, it is known as the bedrock of the entire foundation of an organization. If an organization does not have proper GRC in place, it is really, really on shaky grounds. If an organization does not have proper GRC, it runs the risk of really, really some serious trouble, both from a regulatory standpoint and from a business standpoint. And so we want to make sure that we understand this whole business of GRC. First of all, we look at this word governance. Now, the word governance actually comes from, and I'm just going to take a couple of minutes to do this, it comes from the word to steer, to direct, to guide, to govern. We know that certainly when we talk about the leadership of even our country, you're talking about the governor, you're talking about, anytime you hear governor or governance or governing, it has to do with leadership, it has to do with the head, it has to do with how something is directed or managed. When we talk about risks, we're talking about the likelihood of something happening over which you have no control. And businesses take risks every day. We in our personal lives take risk every day without even thinking about it. But risk is that element of life which occurs and you have no control over it. As for a business has to be very careful that it pays close attention to the issue of risk. Risk is going to be one of the things that a business would want to be very careful of. In fact, even from its inception, a business would want to do very good research on the type of risks that it's getting into, the type of risk from its product line, the type of risk from its potential customer base, the type of risk that would affect the company and really determine whether or not it survives or it goes under. And so risk is very important. Then we come to this whole business of compliance. Compliance has to do with adherence to established laws, procedures, any standards in place. When you comply with those, when you adhere to them, you are said to be in compliance. If you do not adhere to them, then you're said to be non-compliant, or that you are not in compliance. And so here it is, we put these three words together: governance, risk, and compliance, and we come up with this whole business of how a business is managed and directed, how a business is controlled on a daily basis, how you manage a business, how you control the business, how you set the strategic direction for a business is found in its governance, risk, and compliance module. And so we have to make sure that we revisit these terms, governance, risk, and compliance, to ensure that we are on the right track as a business in the way the business is managed and controlled. If the business is managed properly, if it is controlled properly, then we know that it has a greater potential of survival than the converse. And so governance, leading, directing, risk, the likelihood that something might happen over which you have no control, compliance, adherence to established standards and procedures. Now, when we talk about this GRC, we know that GRC can only be effective if you have some very critical elements in place. One of the most critical elements of a proper GRC system will be the whole issue of corporate governance. When we talk about corporate governance, we're talking about how a business operates on a daily basis, whether or not it has established policies and procedures. And when we talk about policies and procedures, I hasten to add that policies and procedures must be written. It is not good enough for somebody to say, okay, this business has standards, it has policies and procedures, but it's in somebody's head walking around, and that's the person who knows what to do, when to do, and the person is what you call the key person in the company. No, every viable business has written policies and procedures which ought to be accessible to all staff members. Policies and procedures ought to be clear, they ought to be written, and they ought to be flexible. They ought to have an element in it where it is reviewed periodically and adjustments are made to suit the times. The main point there is that what you may set up as policies and procedures at the inception of a company may have to be tweaked as things change. Regulatory standards change. The economy changes all the time. And so your competitors, they change. And so there's so many things that will cause you to have to constantly review your policies and procedures to ensure that they are as relevant as possible. Once again, when we talk about policies and procedures, it is very important to ensure that your policies and procedures are basically tailored to your institution. It is so unfortunate that so many institutions may just get policies and procedures or buy perhaps some program off the shelf which may not be relevant to that company. And so it's very important for every company to have policies and procedures and to have standards in place which are suitable, relevant for that type business. Now, once again, when we talk about this whole business of risk, some of the determinants of risk are the type of business you are in. And so your product line will determine the type of risk that you will face. Your customer base will determine the type of risk you will face. We have some persons who are naturally high risk, some persons are lower risk, some people are low risk. And so you would have to look at your risk management process and build it to suit your client base, your product line, and the jurisdiction you are in. Will also determine the type of risk that you may be facing. There are some jurisdictions that really are known for, or it is suspected at least, that these jurisdictions are at greater risk of some things materializing than other jurisdictions. And so risk is a key element. Governance, how you manage the company, is a key element. Compliance is critical. And so we put these three together and we're talking about how viable a business might be. And so just thought we will give you that backdrop just to remind you of this whole business of GRC, governance, risk, and compliance, and to talk about how businesses can survive if they pay attention to GRC, or conversely, they would be at risk if they do not pay close attention to their GRC system. And so what we are going to do for a couple of minutes is to look at this, the first case. Everybody has his or her material, so we can look at the first case together. Just before we go into the, first case on Lehman Brothers, let us look at this whole issue of risk governance, risk, and compliance, and the perspective of the Open Compliance and Ethics Group. Now, this year is a very, very important group, and their definition or their perspective on GRC is certainly worth considering. So we'll call it the OCEG. They describe this whole business of governance, risk, and compliance as being a system of people, processes, and technology which enables an organization to do several things, which we will go through this evening. Those who would have sat with me before will know that the nuggets, eh? The nuggets is that saying to you, you don't have time to eat the whole chicken, you don't have time to be dealing with all those other things, the bones and all that kind of stuff, and so we give you some nuggets. Now, when we talk about these nuggets here, how many of you are sitting with me for the first time? Okay. Just to say to you, often you may be caught, everybody has? Often you may be caught in traffic, or you may be at the office with nothing to do, or you may just be totally bored, almost to death, and you have time to pick up something in the next couple of days. I would recommend that you pick these up. If you look at the book, sometimes the book is a little intimidating or it's too big. You don't want to be toting around that book. And so I give you something on a couple of sheets for you to keep with you. You can keep it in the car. Don't read while you're driving, but keep it in the car and read it at your leisure. And so this OCEG, what do they say about this whole business of governance, risk, and compliance? The first thing they say is that it is a system of people, processes, and technology which enables an organization to do several things. First of all, it helps an organization to prioritize its stakeholders' expectation. That's important. If you're setting up a business, obviously you have relevant stakeholders. You have persons who may be shareholders, you may have persons who are your employees, you may have persons who may fall into the definition of stakeholders from various perspectives. You want to make sure that your governance, risk, and compliance GRC system actually serves their best interests and their expectation. Nobody buys into a company without some expectation of some gainful return. I mean, people just don't throw their money out there like that. And so once you would have invested in a company or you are employees of a company, you would want to know that what you expect of that company is actually materialized. And so it helps the GRC, helps a business to actually prioritize the expectations of your various stakeholders. It also sets business objectives to make sure that it's that the values of the business are known and clearly shared. Now, all of these here, let me put right out front so that I'm not accused of plagiarizing. All of this here came right from your material. I pull it out, and you don't have time to be reading all that stuff, and so I pull those up the snippets. And so I was supposed to put that on here, that this actually was an excerpt or derived from the material. I just thought I could say that to you. Another thing that the GRC does is it helps to achieve objectives while optimizing the risk profile and protecting value. This whole business of risk profile is very important for a company to undergo a risk profiling process. That helps for several reasons. First of all, it helps you to know who your customers are. It helps you to know how to risk rate your customers. And your product line, it helps you to risk rate your products. And so this whole business of risk profiling from a GR perspective is very, very important. It also helps in protecting the values of the company. If you have a good GRC system in place, it helps to ensure that you maintain the value. Every company has some sort of value, whether they recognize it or not, but some values are more expressed than others. The GRC helps the company to ensure that they retain and maintain the value of the company over time. When you talk about value, what is it? What are the core values of a company? What do they believe in? Some companies have as their value that they are corporate, socially responsible company, which means that they look out for the environment in which they operate. They try to help to build the environment. They try to give back to the environment. That could be their value. The GRC will help them to ensure that corporate social responsibility is maintained throughout the company. Some companies may have as its value that we are profit driven and we will try to increase the bottom line no matter what. That may be their value. And so the GRC will help them look after and maintain that value. The GRC also helps the company to operate within the legal, contractual, internal, social, and ethical boundaries. This is very critical because one of the hallmarks of the GRC system is that it points a company in the direction of its regulatory responsibility. Just about every financial institution you can think of has some regulatory obligation. And so your GRC will help the company to move in a direction which will help it to be compliant with its regulatory obligation. We know that failure to adhere to the regulatory requirements can land a company in serious trouble. We know that companies face huge fines for regulatory breaches, and so certainly it's important that companies remain within their legal, contractual, regulatory obligations. The GRC also provides relevant, reliable, and timely information to appropriate stakeholders. Reliable, it's key. Timely is also key. You can have reliable information, but it comes in far too late, as we will see with Lehman Brothers and Royal Bank of Scotland. Credible information, when you look back and everybody can see clearly, 2020, when you look behind and you say, you said they should have done this, a company should have done that. Anyone can sit today and say, perhaps any company you can think of would have fared better had they done this thing or the other. Had they done it this way versus the way they actually did it. And so information is good, but if it's not timely, it is not nearly as useful as it can be. And so it's important that the GRC has time frames in place within which objectives ought to be achieved. The GRC also enables measurement of the performance. Why would a business be operating every day if it doesn't pause from time to time to measure whether or not it is effective? A business ought to pause and to ensure that it's going in the right direction, that its objectives are being met, that it needs to review its systems every so often to ensure that it is still meeting the regulatory requirements, that it's still up there with its competition and hasn't been left behind. So often a business run the risk, if they're not constantly reviewing what they're doing, they run the risk of falling behind. And actually its competitors can do better over time if they do not keep up with its competitors. And so it helps to measure performance and effectiveness of the system. The OCEG also opines that it's important for the GRC process to be integrated from the standpoint that It can take all various disciplines within a company and hone those together, actually work those together, and to ensure that all aspects of the company are moving in the same direction. So often you can have within one company varied, differing objectives within the same company. You can have the HR department having a different objective from the legal department, having a different objective from compliance, having a different objective from IT. Wouldn't it be a whole lot more effective if all of them were working together, moving in the same direction, attempting to achieve the same objective? And so the GRC is much more effective when all aspects of the company, every discipline within the company, is working hand in hand. It's also important to have the GRC activities across risk categories and departments. Um, if this is not if this is not the case, you can have various departments, as I said, almost having competing interests and putting itself at risk, because you can have one part of the company at risk, and that risk is not even known or shared by another aspect of the company. Good evening. Catch this. And so another standpoint of the GRC is that it helps activities within the business processes. You can actually work better when all your processes are on one accord, when all your processes are working towards the same objective. And then the final point there is that the GRC actually works better in an integrated way when you have a single version of the GRC program. When you do not have mixed signals, when you do not have differing standards within the same entity. We also want to share with you that businesses must ensure that the benefits derived from the GRC program, that the benefits are commensurate with the expenses. It is foolhardy to put a GRC system in place that is not cost effective for the company. Once again, companies run the risk of going out and getting or implementing a GR system which might not be relevant for that company. The GR system, and sometimes these systems are very costly. You can imagine actually overhauling your entire policies and procedures and your compliance program, your risk management program unnecessarily. You may go to the extent, and we know that even jurisdictions have also done this. In fact, the Bahamas was accused in 2000 and 2001 of going too far left, meaning over-regulating as opposed to sufficiently regulating the sector. And so the GRC system must be cost effective. You must make sure that the companies ought to make sure that they conduct a cost benefit analysis to ensure that the money spent to implement the GRC system is actually worth it when you look at the results to be derived from the system. And so the effectiveness, next one is the effectiveness of the GRC strategy can vary based on several things. It can vary based on the sector that you are in, the type of business, the type of product line, your client base, the jurisdiction you're operating in, and your products and services. All these things you can look at these as being the things that could serve as barriers to the most effective operation of your business. These can serve as hindrances if you do not look at them in the most effective manner. And so you want to be very careful that there are certain things that could adversely affect your GRC program. You also say that businesses face two major categories of challenges. One set of the challenges come from the regulatory side, meaning whether or not you are adhering to or in good stead with your regulator versus, and also the business side, which means that you want to make sure that the business remains viable on a daily basis. Now, this whole business of regulation, let's take a couple of seconds to look at that. It's very critical for the GRC program to be tailored and to be established based on the regulation that the entity is subjected to. We know that there's specific regulation, laws, policies, and procedures for various types of business entities. And so once you have a business entity that has recognized what its regulator requires of it, it is in a better position to set up an effective GRC program. Otherwise, once again, the entity might set up a system, GRC system, which still may not meet the requirements of the regulator. And so, as business environments has changed in recent years, we know that it's important for the GRC system to be effective and relevant. It must be relevant. You may have a company which was established 3, 5, 10 years ago, may have had sound policies and procedures at that point in time, but with the regulatory changing environment, it might not be, those policies and procedures may not be relevant today. And so obviously the policies and procedures must be tweaked, must be adjusted, must be amended periodically. Now, in order for the GRC to be effective, companies must always periodically conduct risk assessment. Are we still able to mitigate the risks that this company faces? Risk by its client, risk by its product line, risk by its services. And so periodically, every company ought to conduct periodic risk assessment. However, before we get to the business of risk assessment, it is very important for a business to do a thorough risk identification program. And so once you would have identified all of the risks inherent in your product line, then you will be able to assess those risks, and then you will be in a position to mitigate or manage those risks effectively. In order for the GRC program to be effective, you must have stringent and sound policies and procedures. Policies and procedures which, once again, cater to the needs of your company. You must make sure also, a company should also ensure that with its GRC system, that its IT system are relevant to that company. So often companies go and get an IT system off the shelf, and we know of several horror stories, even locally, where companies, agencies would have gotten an IT system which is not relevant to the company. Spend huge sums of money, bought something off the shelf, which perhaps might even be for a different industry, and was not tailored to that company. And so it does not make sense. It's not the best use of a company's resources to get an IT system which is not relevant for that company. The GRC system must ensure that there are accountabilities and that people know what they are responsible for. Once people are given levels of accountability, they know that they need to act responsibly, and all those things ought to be enshrined in the GRC system. And then there ought to be effective lines of communication. That means that across departments ought to talk to each other. You cannot have a system of an organization where the HR doesn't talk to PR, PR doesn't talk to compliance, compliance doesn't talk to legal, legal doesn't talk to the business. All these things can cause serious challenges if you have a breakdown in communication within an organization. So the most effective GRC system calls for effective communication within the organization. Then what about communication, external communication? It is very important for there to be established lines of communication, and you would have remember from your material tells you about having effective lines of communication, ensuring things like you have a policy on communication with the media. Anybody remember that? Who talks to the media? Who is able to talk to the media? That ought to be written so that when the media comes, or making inquiries, or regulators come making inquiries, who talks to the regulator? All of these things ought to be enshrined in your GRC system because it says these are the lines of communication. This is how this company communicates. We also say that the GRC system requires clear communication channels. That's slightly different, but it all speaks to communication. Communication channels meaning you have some companies where all communication is top down. And then you have other institutions where all communication is bottom up. However, the most effective is usually a combination where you have communication coming down, communication going up. There's a meeting of the minds across the entire organization. And so communication is very, very effective, and it ought to be written exactly the type of communication channels that's within an organization. And so to take it a step further, he said that the credit crisis of the mid and late 2000 shows how important it is for GRC program to be effective. First of all, it ought to be able to identify, understand, control, remediate, and monitor/manage risk. If a company has not identified its inherent risk, the risk that it faces on a daily basis, it runs the risk of what occurred with these other horror stories that we are aware of, the Lehman Brothers and the others. And so a company must first and foremost identify the type of risk that it faces. It must also understand or have a clear view of how it can go about assessing or determining the severity of the risk that it faces. We know that some companies have varying degrees of risk tolerance. You have some companies which are risk averse. They don't go down the line of anything that even appears to have huge risk. You have some companies which really, welcomes risk because I guess they understand after a while that it's somehow recognized that when you take huge risks, sometimes the benefit could be worth it. And I'm pausing when I'm saying that because the opposite is also true. Sometimes you take huge risks, it can be devastating to the company. But a company needs to understand the level of risk that it faces. Another important aspect of from the credit crisis, it shows that companies ought to be able to control its risks. If it cannot control the risks that it faces, it's already in trouble. It ought to have systems in place to combat the risk, to monitor the risk on a daily basis, and to ensure that the risk is managed effectively. And so the risk management program of a company is very, very important. Now, your material says to you that there's a strong case for centralizing the GRC system. It suggests that when you centralize the GRC system, that there's some benefits that can be derived from it. It says that it can help you to manage a wide array of risks in a more effective way. It helps you to manage your regulatory and legislative challenges. It is more cost effective to have a centralized GRC rather than one part of the business having standards that are different from another part of the company. It says that if you establish a GRC program which actually encompasses all aspects of the business, the suggestion is much more effective. It also says that when you have a centralized GRC system, that communication can be much more effective, meaning that everybody is on the same wavelength, everybody is moving in the same direction, and it's easier to talk to people when you have when you have common objectives. Now, if your objectives are varied, it is difficult to even have a sensible conversation about how you manage or mitigate risk. It also says that the creation of standardized risk dashboard with agreed parameters, meaning that if you set a system in place that helps you to monitor on a daily basis what is happening within your company, setting parameters as to how you manage your tasks. If you have tasks that are time sensitive, are you meeting the deadlines? If you have tasks which require heavy manpower, do you have the resources in place? If you have tasks that need to be achieved, do you have the skill set in place? So all of these things are very, very important when it comes to the business of whether or not you're going to centralize versus decentralize your GRC system. It goes further to talk about the profile and credibility of the risk and compliance team. It says that they can be improved both internally and externally based on several matters. One of them being better understanding of an organization's risk if it is centralized. It helps you to also have a higher quality of information from multiple sources if you are on one wavelength and there is a centralized GRC system. Now, it also you also need to recognize too that there's some challenges in implementing a centralized GRC system. One of them, the first one that it mentions is potential language barrier. Now, when we talk about language barrier, not necessarily language as we know it in terms of English versus another language. We're talking about language barrier right within the same organization where you have different departments speaking different language. You have different departments where each department has its own culture. That can cause some problems. If you have within one organization different departments having different mandates and they operate differently, their communication lines are different, it is said that that can adversely affect you centralizing your GRC. It also says if you have different levels of how people perceive risk, this whole business of usually people who work in the compliance function have a much better understanding of risk than persons who work in other areas. However, there's a need to ensure that everybody within the organization has a clean and clear understanding of the risks faced by the company. We said, but from a different perspective, but it's relevant here. If you have an organization where the view is that anything to do with risk management, we divert that to the compliance department or the compliance function. Not so at all. In fact, we said that the human resources department or your personnel department, whatever name is given to persons who are responsible for engaging new persons, they too ought to be cognizant of the risks that the company faces. They ought to be cognizant that if they do not screen people properly, they could end up bringing people into the company who may not be suited to the task, or persons in the company who may not be in tune with the risk management system that you have in place or want to promote. And so it's very important for there to be common understanding across different departments. And also, another thing that could impede the progress of the GRC is this whole business of having a paradigm shift, having a change in mindset. Some persons, particularly those who may not be exposed to the material that you have been exposed to, who understand compliance and risk management, they may have a closed mind to how companies ought to be managing the risk. First of all, they may have a closed mind to the fact that their business that they work in faces risk on a daily basis. And so, just thought we would share that with you as a backdrop to this whole business of your GRC program, whether it ought to be centralized versus decentralized, how the advantages of having it centralized, and how important it is to have everybody within the institution going in the same direction. And so let's take a couple minutes to review this case study on Lehman Brothers. Let me ask at the onset, before we even get into the details of Lehman Brothers, how many of you would say that you have a fairly reasonable appreciation of what happened with Lehman Brothers? Moving right along, let us look at Lehman Brothers. Let us look at some of the facts around the company, what actually occurred, and what lessons we can learn from what occurred with Lehman Brothers. Now we want to say first of all that Lehman Brothers was a very, very, what somebody may call a very, very prosperous, and from all indication, from a business standpoint, a business with great potential. However, from your GRC perspective, you will see that some things perhaps could have, should have been done differently, and because they were not done differently, the outcomes were less than desirable. And so I share with you, I just pulled out from your material a couple of the pertinent facts for us to go through and try to get a sense of what happened here with Lehman. And so the first point that that's mentioned is that it is a financial institution founded 1850. That's way back. It says at the credit crisis, it was the fourth largest investment bank in the United States. Very, very significant. Fourth largest. It also says that Lehman Brothers survived many things in the past until it came forward to the years in the 2000s, meaning that it would have survived what perhaps would have carried some companies under. However, because it did not have the proper GRC system in place, because it did not do some things that it ought to have done, we see that it faced some serious risks, and we see that the results were very telling, and we're still talking about it even today. Now we know that we want to share with you also that Lehman Brothers made some, they acquired some companies which they ought not to have acquired. We said that we talk about the leadership, and a lot of things within a company actually starts and ends with the leadership of the company. It starts and ends with leadership. Whether or not a company survive has quite a bit to do with who is at the helm and who is steering it. Remember GRC, steering it in the right direction. You're talking about somebody who is actually in leadership position, directing the daily operation of the company. And so we see that the board of Lehman Brothers, we said it comprised 10 executive directors. Anybody see the next point there?
70 years.
I mean, someone may say, well, that means they had a whole wealth of knowledge, experience, and as the late Paul Adley said, you have to be very careful if you're talking about a person who has been doing the same thing for 100 years. That might mean that that person only knows one thing and has been doing the same one thing over and over for 100 years, whether that was right or wrong. That, though, ought to jump out at you. That the vast majority of the leadership um, was in an age bracket that perhaps some persons would be concerned about. It can go either way. I mean, somebody may put forth an argument and say, you know what, that was an asset, that was advantageous to them because of what they brought to the table, having seen all they would have seen. But let us leave that for right now. It also says that the Finance and Risk Committee met twice. Finance and Risk Committee met twice between 2007 and 2008. Finance and Risk Committee. Let me just throw out to you, your Finance and Risk Committee, how often would you say they ought to meet? At least quarterly, at a bare minimum. And particularly during these times, because things start to get a little fuzzy from 2005. Certainly as we went into 2006, definitely during 2007, there were sufficient signals around that there was cause for concern in the global financial services sector, which would have caused any board to recognize that its key committees, particularly its Finance and Risk Committee, to meet more often. Your Finance and Risk Committee, they're really the ones who are looking at the numbers, who are looking at the risk management systems to see whether or not they're still effective. They're the ones looking at the internal control mechanisms within the company. They're the ones looking at the corporate governance structure, whether or not it's still meeting its objectives. Looking at, from the standpoint of your compliance program, whether or not you're still doing proper, keyword, whether or not you're still doing proper KYC, whether or not you're still doing proper monitoring, transactions monitoring, whether or not you're still doing proper assessment of what occurs on a daily basis. And so for you to have your Finance and Risk Committee having met twice within this critical time globally says something about the company. Or let us fast track to what the CEO surmised. The CEO surmised that, well, there really wasn't anything too serious to be concerned about. However, let us see what happened over those couple of years. First point that I pulled out from there is that somebody wants to read that for us, please. Read a couple bullet points.
And the situation?
Yes.
In February 2007, Lehman's share price was over $68. U.S. housing market was showing signs of weakness from loan default. In March 2007,
Sorry. Let's stick a pen right there. When we're talking about the weakness from loan defaults, let us talk about what is that about? Anybody remember what that was about? Anybody recognize that we talk about, particularly with the housing sector, a lot of persons were being quote unquote qualified for mortgages that they did not qualify for. Banks were giving loans to persons who did not qualify for the loans. The housing, the entire U.S. housing market was in trouble. And a lot of it was traced back to the whole business of the loans that were given to people who could not manage those loans, who really did not qualify for those loans and should not have had those loans in the first place. And then it has also something to do with the valuation of real estate in that point in time. Go forward, please.
In March 2007, CFO said that defaults were not at risk, under control.
Okay, that's the CFO now. The CFO says that they were really not at risk, and that everything was under control. That is the CFO saying that in 2000, in March of 2007, when there were already signs around that things were not as they ought to have been. Go ahead, please.
CFO saw no risk to housing market or the U.S. economy by default.
Okay, as far as the CFO was concerned, we'll get through this. It's no real risk. I mean, and then, okay, no risk to the housing market, and perhaps even if the housing market is affected a little bit, it really would not affect the U.S. economy. The U.S. economy is still strong and robust, and everything is going to be all right. Go ahead, please.
Later in 2007, Lehman continued underwriting more residential mortgage-backed securities than other products. At the end of 2007, Lehman's stock value rebounded. Lehman became very vulnerable to deteriorating market conditions. In 2008, Lehman shares dropped by 48% as Bear Stearns nearly collapsed. Lehman's credit ratings were downgraded and clients were leaving.
Okay, stop right there a second, please. How many of you have your material with you? Let's turn, please, to page 282. Page 282. Is that where you have the case study on Lehman? Okay, read that last paragraph for me, please.
Lehman Brothers board was dominated by Richard S. Funk Jr., who held the positions of chairman of the board.
Shut up. Little. Read it, but more slowly, please. Okay. Start again, and I need you to slow down when you reach this part.
Lehman Brothers board was dominated by Richard S. Funk Jr., who held the positions of chairman of the board, chairman of the executive committee, and chairman executive officer. The board was comprised of 10 executive directors, half of whom were over 70 years old, 2 being over the age of 80.
Imagine the kind of conversations that they would have had at board meetings. How do you think the board meetings went? I hope they didn't feed them, because perhaps then they're...
Take medication or
Okay, go ahead reading there for me, please.
The executive committee, besides folk, comprised the chief operating officer, the chief finance officer, and an independent director. The finance and risk committee was chaired by an 80-year-old executive director and had only met twice in 2007 and 2008, despite the rapidly unfolding credit crisis.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. If you're minded to continue, drop down 2 paragraphs, please. Start reading from later in 2007.
Later in 2007, the credit crisis deepened with a major correction in the U.S. housing market gathering pace. Despite these indications, Lehman continued with its significant role in the major market by underwriting more residential mortgage-backed securities than any other business. Its portfolio reached $85 billion, a leverage ratio of approximately 4 times shareholders' equity. By the end of 2007, this appeared to be a prudent decision as its stock value rebounded from reductions earlier in the year, but this was only temporary.
Yes, please.
This high degree of leverage, ratio of assets to shareholder equity, and huge portfolio of RMBS made Lehman extremely vulnerable to deteriorating market conditions. In March 2008, competitor Bear Stearns, the second largest underwriter of RMBS, nearly collapsed, prompting a 48% fall in the value of Lehman shares. Investors were concerned that Lehman would be next. Losses on subprime mortgages were increasing. The company's credit rating from credit reference agencies was downgraded, and clients were leaving the company in record numbers. In June 2008, the company announced a quarter two loss of 2.8 billion. In September 2008, the value of Lehman stock fell by 77% in 1 week, and attempts to sell parts of the business were proving to be unsuccessful. September was the turning point. Third quarter losses of 3.9 billion were announced, and it was quickly running out of time. Yet, the board seemed to be unable to understand the seriousness of the situation. There was no investigation by the independent directors. There was no special study by the board's finance and risk committee. There was no call for capital injection, even though it was desperately needed.
Thank you very much. You remember that, not just what you would have read in this material here, I know you would have remembered from many other points of your reading how critical it is to have an effective board in place. You would have heard over and over again that everything starts and ends with the board of directors. It is obvious that the failings of this company has a lot to do with the board. First of all, one could question the composition of the board. One could question the competency of the board. One could question when I say competency, obviously some of the decisions which were being made to go into a market that was already in trouble and investing in subprime real estate, and to see things falling apart with no serious effort being made or recorded to try to turn things around, speaks to the failings of the board. Speaks to the failings of the board. But let's take it a step further, though. I need you to read for me, please, the summation by the chief. And I call him chief, and I put that in inverted commas because he was really the chief for so many reasons. No, look at the summary, the nuggets, please.
Oh, and another is the company, Lehman, was overwhelmed.
That's what the chief said now. The chief said, okay, you know what happened? We would have been okay, but the company was overwhelmed. There's a lot of stuff going on that we just did not have capacity to deal with. We were just overwhelmed. What else did he say?
Affected by stabilizing factors, rumors, widening credit default swaps, naked short selling, attacks, credit agency downgrades, loss of confidence by clients and counterparties, strategic buyers on sidelines, and no government aid.
None of these things happen to a company in isolation. None of these. Every one of these elements here is tied into something else. He talked about the credit rating downgrades. No matter what you say about credit rating agencies, they have information, they have data, they know that they are subject to serious scrutiny if they just inadvertently downgrade a company. Here it is, though, the chief is saying that the ratings agency, the rating company, just picked on us and downgraded us for no reason at all. He is also saying that we were attacked. There was a lot of rumors out there about us. All of these things he is contributing to the failures of the company. Basically saying, well, people just didn't like us. People just conspired against us. You had, and then after all of that, the government didn't come and help us. Now here it is, you have a company that is, for a long period of time, very, very profitable, doing very good for a long period of time. And at the end of the day, when there is trouble and there is some shaking within the company says government didn't come to our aid. And so go a little further, please. Read a couple more things on there, please.
On the same nugget,
Yes.
chief folks remuneration package between 2000 and 2007 was 485 million.
That's 485,000.
Million.
485 million, not 4.5, not 4.85, not 45, not 48.
I just need 0.5. Just a 0.5.
And one may beg the question, okay, you're talking about from 2000 to 2007, that's what he got all together. But once again, this company did not start to go in the wrong direction overnight. This is a combination of things that went wrong. And the principle here, the main point here is that you can still have somebody being paid that amount of money and at the helm and comes up with points like this. The credit rating agencies did not like this. People did not like this. People had rumors about us. What do you think the same person will say in the years when they were profitable? What justification can he give for the profitability if he can cry all of these things when things went bad? Go a step further, please. Read the lessons learned, yes.
Title II of the Dodd-Frank Act gives the FDIC authority to regulate the entire conglomerate of a financial institution. The orderly.
Sorry. Before you go too far there, what has happened there? What is being stated there is that if you have one aspect of a company that is doing well and another aspect of the company is not doing well, or one aspect of a company is being heavily regulated or sufficiently regulated, while another is not subject to regulation or it has a regulation light touch, like a ticking of the box. The suggestion there is that this act is saying that they need to correct that. It needs to make sure that an entire conglomerate, all aspects of a company, are subjected and subject to the same level of regulation and oversight. And so what happened here is that Lehman was doing some things, all of which was not being monitored equally. Go ahead, please.
The Orderly Liquidation Authority has power to act decisively to preserve asset value.
Once again, a company's asset value, it's critical for that to be maintained for many reasons. Shareholders, the stability of the entire economy, very, very important. Read the next point, please.
FCID could have structured a transaction to sell Lehman's valuable assets to interested buyers.
Obviously, this all is hindsight, based on what point they were talking about, how long do you think there would have been an interest in buying into Lehman? Certainly, when Lehman was in trouble, I don't see anybody in his or her right mind would have wanted to be buying into a company that is failing or that its numbers are going in the opposite direction. And so, read the last point there, please.
A sale of Lehman's assets would have provided systemic stability and put any losses on shareholders and creditors.
Okay, sorry that word there up top should have been assets, ASSETS, an extra out there. But what it's saying here is that perhaps the wrong person suffered here, and you have a system now where you have some corrective measures in place, that persons who are actually responsible ought to be held accountable for the failings of a company. Obviously, this year is a situation where the board of directors failed, but more importantly, the man at the helm definitely failed. Any concern about what all the different hats this one person wore? Any concerns there at all? I mean,
Yeah, too much.
unless he was an extremely brilliant man, extremely brilliant man, no one person should have held all those key
He
positions.
was protecting his interest.
Certainly. Let's look again on let's look again on page 283. Could you read those questions for us, please? Let's take a couple moments to look at those questions. Yes, to the bottom. Some questions on 283.
Why were the directors unable to understand the crisis in the company?
Somebody may say they were too old, too busy. Maybe they had other interests, and that's why the GRC program speaks of whether or not a company is properly led, directed, and managed. If a company's leadership does not have the interest of the relevant stakeholders, as we said earlier, the company will go in the wrong direction. And so obviously these directors were not properly focused. They did not take as their priority the interest of relevant stakeholders. Read the next question, please.
Where were the external auditors?
No mention at all. Do you think they would have been subject to an external audit at this point in time? First of all, before you even get to the external auditors, what occurred with the internal auditors?
The CFO was the internal auditor.
So you see why this year went south. There's no mention at all about, because if they had external auditors, obviously some of these things would have been caught. There should have been some recommendations, firm recommendations coming out of this. But on top of all of that, read the next question, please.
Why had they not raised concerns about the company's exposure to loss through RMBS?
Did they know? Did they know? Read the next question, please.
Could the board's culture have been driven by feelings of invincibility after 158 years of success?
These guys, all of whom are over 70 and over 80, obviously over 70. I wonder how long they would have been in this company, because maybe they've been there from maybe they came out of high school and then straight. And maybe after they would have gone through so much, they perhaps say, you know what?
We could bounce back.
Be good. I like that. Nothing can happen here. Be all right. And then the next bullet point is basically the same, them having overconfidence. But within this whole thing, though, and the last point I want us to look at on this year, where is the regulatory tone in this whole thing? What of the regulators? No mention of regulatory oversight. We talk also, I mentioned several times about the importance of having a good regulatory framework in place to ensure things like this do not happen. And even if they were, once they recognize, if they ever did, if they ever recognized that they were in trouble, shouldn't they have gone into the regulator and perhaps gotten some help from the regulator as to how to make certain adjustments? But very, very sad story. And as I mentioned, the truth about it now is we can just look at it and to see what we can learn, some do's and don'ts from Lehman Brothers. But putting this in the context of your GRC, all of this show how important it is. It shows how important it is to have proper people at the head, the leadership, how important it is to have them, have people in the company on one accord, Remember, we talked about the point of having people moving in the same direction across the companies. Or how important it is. There's also beyond the board, certainly not in this text. I saw something somewhere else, but certainly in this text here, it does not speak of what occurred with senior management who should have been just below them. Did they have any authority to do anything? Did they do anything? What did they do on a daily basis? Everything in here points to the board. Once again, it could be that they're speaking to the importance of the board, but imagine how you would have felt like as a division head. Let's say you were what about the MLRO for this company? What was he or she going through on a daily basis? So they did not have one. Okay. Let me take that point back then. Okay, they
No
did not
internal
have
audit, no
one.
compliance.
But you see what can go wrong if you don't have a proper GRC system in place. Let us take quickly this next point of the RBS, this whole Royal Bank of Scotland. Let's pull some of the salient points out of that and to see what we can glean and put this in the perspective of our GRC. You still okay with reading?
Yeah, I got
Okay, good. Thank you. Thank you. Go ahead for us, please. Let's read some of the facts. Yeah, read some of the facts about our Royal Bank of Scotland.
Royal Bank of Scotland was founded in 1727 by Royal Charter from King George I. Royal Bank of Scotland saw incredible growth under CEO Sir Fred Goodwin. Royal Bank of Scotland assets totaled 1.9 trillion. Liabilities were at 1.8 trillion. The Royal Bank of Scotland collapsed in 2008. The British government acquired 82%. CEO claimed that Royal Bank of Scotland was conscious of risk from subprime loans. Royal Bank of Scotland.
Sorry, and allow me just to make the point. This is after it failed. He said they were conscious. Go ahead.
The Royal Bank of Scotland purchase of ABN AMRO led to its downfall. In 2009, I could just say they.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. In 2009, it suffered loss of 24 billion, biggest of UK company. UK government bailout was 37 billion. Sir Fred resigned in November 2008 and stripped of knighthood. Observation. The CEO walked away with a lump sum.
You need to get this. You need to get this.
The CEO walked away from Royal Bank of Scotland with a lump sum of 3 million. The CEO had annual pension of £703,000 payable for life. The package was agreed to by the government. Chancellor of the Exchequer requested CEO return some funds. The CEO refused the request. The Financial Services Authority was criticized for its inaction. The regulator succumbed to pressure from the industry. The regulator used a culture of ticking the box, which failed. The regulator should have prevented Royal Bank of Scotland from taking ABN AMRO. 10 questions worth considering.
These are some critical questions. Continue reading and then we'll come back.
Royal Bank of Scotland post-2009. In 2010, it had losses of 1.1 billion, paid staff bonuses of 1 million, gave 1 million to 100 senior executives.
Senior.
That's why he was
Stephen Hester succeeded Goodwin with salary of 1.1 million and bonus and pension. Hester chose not to accept his 2010 bonus after complaints of Bank's performance.
It's a nice guy.
In 2013, government withheld bonuses to Hester and other senior staff decision based on 81% share
notwithstanding all they went through, and then they given out money and all of that, and then the government, when they came back for a bonus in 2013, the government said, no, 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 no. We already bailed you out. The government owns the largest portion of this. It is unconscionable for us to pay you bonus because this money comes out of the treasury. This is the people's money. This is not your money, and so you do not get money. That's basically what happened.
Hester received a payoff of 1.65 million upon resignation in 2013.
How much? How much?
1.65 million pounds. Ross McEllen succeeded Hester with an alleged package between 2.75 million pounds and 4.75 million pounds.
So they didn't. Sorry, did they learn? Oh, if they see that much more valuable, go ahead.
The Royal Bank of Scotland returned to profitability in 2014, and senior staff were given maximum EU bonuses, 100% of salaries. The rationale: it affected only 0.5% staff and was intended to hold high-paid fighters.
And so we see here a company that once again had a rich history, had a great footing in its society, in its environment, did well perhaps, however, had major failings. And if you look at it again, the failings are all attributable to leadership. Leadership. Now, I don't know how you feel about it, but if you're making big bucks like that, and somebody calling you sir, everybody calling you sir, you have a designation of sir, you've been given a knighthood, and the only punishment you get seemingly is for them to take the knighthood from you. I mean, would you lose any sleep over that? I mean, for them to say that you're not sir anymore, and you move from sir to mister, but they don't take the money. And notice what it says. He was asked to return the money. Asked, first of all, asked. That's the key word. He was asked to return the money. Could you please, pretty please, give us some of that money back? And he said, not a thing like it. And so we have to realize now, pension for life, £203,000.
No, 703.
703,000 pounds for the rest of his life, and the only punishment is that they took the knighthood from him, and he became Mister with all of that money. I mean, how many of you would mind if somebody don't call you sir and don't call you Mister? Guys, do you mind? Do you mind if they don't call you sir and call you Mister? But you're getting 703,000 pounds for the rest of your life. This case here speaks to the importance of having a sound GRC system in place. It speaks to ensuring that you have mechanism in place, first of all, that speaks to how you operate in the most effective manner on a daily basis. It also speaks to how you catch any weaknesses as quickly as possible. It speaks to how you put mechanisms in place to try to correct any weaknesses. It speaks of how you ought to operate in such a way that your stakeholders do not suffer loss. I mean, and what is the it's not mentioned here, but what about the issue of corporate social responsibility? Did they show any concern about anybody else? Did they show any concern about the um, the losses that would have been incurred by shareholders and other relevant stakeholders? There's no reference to it at all. And so obviously you're talking about a leadership crisis again. A company that did not care about how it's going to operate, that persons at the top were satisfied with what was occurring at the top. And then look at what the justification for them eventually giving bonuses of 100% of their salary. The justification there is that, well, this isn't too bad because this one is going to affect 0.5. And it's not everybody. We aren't giving the money to everybody. We only keeping the money up at the top. Don't worry. See, it's okay because, you know. And then too, they also gave us a justification. We have to pay these folks some big bucks. If not, we are not able to retain good bankers. I mean, the truth about it is, I mean, who really pays for weaknesses like this? Who really pay for failings like this? It's usually people who can least afford it. Certainly not the board members, certainly not the CEO, and certainly not this fellow with his knighthood that they took from him eventually. And so, it speaks again to the context of how important it is for us to ensure that the GRC is sound within a company, that it is firm, that it's in place, and that is operational on a daily basis. Otherwise, these things here um, would not have happened if they had a proper GRC that had proper oversight. Um, and going back to your to the lesson on the board responsibility, obviously, these persons got off far too easy, and I believe perhaps they made it through, but because of situations like this, could you imagine a company in the Bahamian context trying something like this? Do you think companies in the Bahamas could get away with this? To the knowledge of, I mean, perhaps if nobody knows, it might be happening. But if this becomes public knowledge, would there be an outcry locally? But you never know. It might be happening. Um, so thank you very much for your assistance. What I want us to do is one more thing before we leave here this evening, and that will be to let's take a couple of minutes to look at what occurred with the cooperatives. And that way, that will save us some time for next week. This one here is much shorter, so you need not be overly concerned. Okay, and for your information, is actually found on page 289. Okay, a designated reader. Can I ask, how many of you are familiar with or are members of cooperatives? Familiar with cooperative, the concept of cooperatives in the Bahamas? Okay, obviously, I believe those persons who are members of cooperative will have a great affinity to what is happening here and to be much more sensitive to what has occurred here. Read for us, please. Read the facts and situations of this situation in the cooperative group.
The cooperative movement is an autonomous association of persons united voluntarily to meet their economic, social, and cultural needs through a jointly owned and democratically controlled enterprise.
Okay, sorry. Anybody ever heard the term people helping people?
Yes.
Members helping, yeah, that's really the concept. People pooling their resources together for the benefit of the whole.
The aim of the cooperative group is to conduct trade among its members in an ethical manner. Any adult who joins must share in the values of the cooperative. The cooperative movement in the UK started in Northern England. The cooperatives expanded from local groups into societies and widened regional boards and the cooperative group board of directors. The group board was responsible for the members' success.
Sorry, read that again, please.
The group board was responsible for the members' success.
The board was responsible for the members' success.
The chairman of the group board was chosen by members and CEO reported to the board. The duty of the board was to ensure business was managed in the interest of members, chart the vision and strategy for members with executive management, supervise the members' risk management systems, oversee the daily management by CEO and executive management, setting governance standards. The situation. In 2013, the cooperative suffered its worst loss in history. The loss occurred mainly in the food division. There was also a crisis in the cooperative bank. Cooperative had to raise $1.5 billion to meet regulatory capital reserve requirements. This led to reduced ownership stake to 30%. The board appointed a new chairman and had a review of the governance mechanisms. An assessment revealed the debt was too high for such an organization. The cooperative required drastic changes in order to survive. Observations. Several things went wrong for the cooperative. Competition in the food market, a poor supermarket acquisition, a poor bank merger, and an apt chairman, poor voting structures, and board domination. Remedial actions. Key specific reform objectives. Appoint persons with requisite skills to manage this type of entity. Ensure protection of cooperative values in future governance models. Ensure that all members benefit and are equally protected. Key reforms to the governance structure. Reform the group board, composition, and skill set. Establish a national membership council, including employee reps. Create a nominations committee to conduct proper screening. Extend constitutional rights to entire membership, one member, one vote. The responses to the recommendations were mixed, however, they were accepted.
Here it is, you have a cooperative, a group of persons pooling their resources for their own interests, starting out very small, then broadening to the region, and then expanding, and then starting to buy other companies, and started to do some other things. Thank you very much for your good reading.
No problem.
Give a little hand, please, for
Thank
reading.
you, y'all. Thanks. I appreciate that.
Corner drop it down.
Alright, see Fallon, be slavery for them.
And so they expanded. However, they expanded beyond the principle of cooperatives. I said before, anybody who understands cooperatives would understand that the cooperative was really intended to operate in a simplistic manner, meaning persons would put their funds in there. Some people put their hard earnings. Some people would put all of their resources in there. Some people would put their personal assets in there, believing that they will operate, as was said earlier, in an ethical manner. It says that the board had a mandate to operate in an ethical manner, meaning that they will do what is right, that they will act in a manner which is in the interest of all members. And then they started doing some funny things. And that's why companies have to be very careful that they have the GR system in place that speaks to how they operate, how they expand, where they operate, what new initiatives they take on, what new areas they go into. If you read the details here, when you read the details, if you have not already done so at your leisure, you will see that it says trouble took place in the food sector. It said that someone was so foolhardy in that you would have them just expanding exponentially, expanding all over the place, putting up food stores all over the place, putting up several food stores in the same community, where you would have one food store competing against another food store, both owned by the same cooperative. Now, what sense does that make? If you're putting your money in a cooperative, you would want the highest return on your investment. They bought companies that were nonsensical to the vision and mandate of that company. And so the truth is, the leadership of the cooperative did not act in the best interest of the members. That's really what it boils down to. And it speaks of the leadership being inept. That means that they started off, and I think they meant well when they started off. A nice cooperative. A few people got together and say, "Man, let's put our monies together. Let's pool our resources." It's basically the concept of almost like an ASU. You get your draw this week and I get my draw and everything. Or we buy in bulk. We go to a particular wholesaler and we purchase goods in bulk, and so we distribute among all of us, and so that everybody saves. That's the kind of concept you have behind cooperatives, meaning that you pool your resources in the best interest of all members involved. However, somebody had a brilliant idea that this cooperative need to start acting like a bank. They need to start operating like a big conglomerate. They need to start doing some things that large financial institutions do. And so they invested in some things that they should not have invested in. Bad decision. They made some decisions which were certainly not conducive to the well-being of the members and suffered huge losses. It goes further to say that the persons in leadership position just were not qualified. And then they brought in some others, and perhaps things settled a bit by that time. So much damage would have been done at that point that it was difficult to rebound. But here it is, you have a situation where you have leadership again, leadership at the helm, making decisions that was not in the best interest of the membership. And so herein lies the importance of your governance, risk, and compliance information. You perhaps will never fall prey to this because you have access to so much valuable information that you will steer um, your company in a different direction altogether. And so, what we want to be mindful of is that anytime we hear of situations like this, let us start to think of the concepts that you would have gone over in your governance, risk, and compliance course. Who was leading? What were the values that they led by? Did it remain important to them to work in the best interest of the stakeholders? Did they operate, and what of the regulatory aspect of this whole thing? Who were the regulators? What of the regulators? Did the regulators step in, or did they step in too late? What was happening as you went along? Now, so often a lot of persons of the view that, okay, when you're talking about banking industry, insurance, financial and corporate services, those things, yeah, they're subject to, they ought to be subject to stringent regulatory framework. But some people may say, okay, if you have some persons coming together in the spirit of pooling resources for the interest of all persons involved, maybe they don't need to be regulated. But look what occurred. A disastrous situation where you have persons perhaps losing all of their possessions in something like this, all because persons did not operate in a prudent manner. And so, what you need to do is to go through the material and put it in the context of GRC. Put it in the context of why would they continue to purchase companies and continue to expand? What was the risk of expanding? Obviously, they expanded beyond their capacity to manage properly. They expanded beyond what was profitable. Because if you have, it's just like you establishing multiple companies and setting one across the street from the other with the same product line. What sense does that make? At the end of the day, you are still the one who is going to suffer the loss, because it's like the old folks saying, you robbing Peter to pay Paul. Does not make sense at all. And so continue to read the material. What we will do next week is have a glance through the remaining 2 case studies, and then we will immediately go to the assignment and start to look at things from there. Let me put that back. Feel free to give me a call if you start your assignment between, or if you've started. How many of you have started already or almost finished? Anybody finished? You finished? Oh,
No!
Brian finished.
You're so proud of him. You're so proud of him.
Almost.
Let me say, if you want to, between now and next week, send me what you have, or call me about what you have. You can do that. And we will go through the case studies, the next 2 case studies next week, after which we will go straight to the assignment. We will try to give you some tips on how to approach the assignment or how to strengthen your assignment. Hit the light switch there. Okay, any questions or concerns? If not, didn't want to keep it the full time. We wanted you to glide back into it. Now, next week, what we want to do is to spend a little more time with those 2 case studies, and then we'll go into the assignment. And then what I would like to do is to make sure so that everybody walks away with a full appreciation of the entire material. I want to take some time to pull the whole course material together. Pull the whole thing together in one big what?
Bible.
One big Bible, he says.
GRC Bible.
Thank you very much. Have a good evening. We'll see you next week.
All right.
Okay, have a good evening. Thanks again.
No problem.
Almost there, good.
Don't get weary. You're almost at the finish line. Have a good evening.
I got question 2 now, so I get I'm gonna be done by end of June.
Me too.
I asked my goal to, so I told her Independence, July 10th, so I'll be home by the 9th. Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Thompson.
Good to see you again.
Okay,
Somebody has the
bye.
roster?
I think we saw your email right up, and I,
Certainly.
NIB.
Feel free to send it there.
Okay, I gotta find it.
Certainly.
I have it, I'm gonna show I have it.
You have it?
Yeah.
Okay.
If you
Yes, ma'am. Okay, have a good evening.
Don't keep that. I'm taking all this. I died. Thank you very much.
Okay, have a good evening.
Because I want to email you some police, the first 2 questions.
Please do. Feel free to do it. I'll give you my.
I'm on question 2 now.
I will give you my comments.
Okay, appreciate it.
Take care. Have a good evening.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Yes.
The first one. Oh, that's right. Sorry. Yes. Okay, have a good evening. Okay. Yes, ma'am. How are you? That's good. Very well, thanks. Very well. How's it going?
Because for me,
Mhm.
to start a new job,
Uh-huh.
the journey compliance officer.
Okay.
We have this assignment we're doing, which you did a commission, experience commission.
Okay.
a
You with the
self-risk
security?
assessment. No, I'm working at a broker dealer.
Okay.
And you know, we have to do a self-risk assessment
Segment.
to the commission on June 22nd. So me and the other
That's like next
compliance
week
officer,
sometime? Yeah.
yes, we working on that. Plus, we both going away next week Friday for training in our London office for 4 weeks. So I only gonna be here for next week's
Certainly,
class.
certainly,
So
certainly.
for me with the paper, I'm really overwhelmed because I
Certainly.
haven't started.
Okay.
And I was looking, I print out the questions, and I just want some, just moment of time, just to quickly.
Is this it?
Yeah, because I just want to know, for me, question one, I can't understand because I know the book. We had a whole section on the role of the compliance officer in the
Okay.
book. So question one, I say we're getting that, and then like me being a compliance officer, I could compare, like you say, what I was looking at comparing how it was, like they said a decade ago,
Yeah.
versus the restrictions and what is required now as a compliance officer.
Certainly.
So I have an idea how to structure that. But when I go down, my mind
So
goes
I haven't seen, I'm seeing this for the first time, so I have no idea.
So I'm like, I
Sorry,
know
have
next
you,
week.
you say you haven't started anything yet?
No.
Okay.
I intend this weekend to at least do question one. I have to do question one because, like I said, where I could be away,
Okay.
I done in the screen trace, and I have this assignment to do while I away.
Okay.
So for me, like I say, I'm hoping next week because especially that's my last class. Because I know you say we have to do case studies, like to get some guidance on sources to turn to for
Certainly.
question 2, 3, and
What
4.
I can do is,
Like always, risk management and one of them.
what I can do, you plan to be here next week?
Yes, I'm coming
Okay.
next week Wednesday because I travel next week Friday.
What I will do. The case studies, I won't spend no more than about half an hour next week. Because I know most persons are concerned. I think they're just
Everybody.
gracious tonight.
We came here, it was like, I mean, when we text, like, why they take so long to start the class, I was like, why they give us such a long break? Because we submitted the assignment April 8th, we didn't get our grade, and we're just ready to end this course.
How do you feel about the first?
The first assignment was fine. I don't like, I passed both. Like for me, the grading, I don't understand because they'll say to me like it was a good paper, but then you only get like 54 or 55, and I'm like, what am I missing to
Somebody
get a
told me
merit
earlier.
60%? Like, come on.
Somebody told me earlier, a gentleman was sharing with me, he's in another class, that he thought they were extremely, extremely rough with the, first of all, with the comments and the grading scale. He thought it was grossly unfair. Apparently, he talked to some other persons in his class too.
Because I know most persons average saying that's what you're getting, and I'm like, what are we missing? Because we getting the feedback from the experts here, doing your research, and yet you're saying it's a good paper, but you can't give me a pass. I mean, I'm thankful that I passed. Some people fail.
Congratulations. I just want to say that some people, congratulations.
They actually put it and say how much people fail the
And let me tell you
percentage.
this too. Some persons who I am aware of fail. They actually people in the industry and have been in the industry for some time. So you ought to be congratulated. Let me do this. And I wish somebody had said something earlier. I'm going to spend very little time on the case study because I mean that's something you can do in your own time. No more than half an hour next week, and I will immediately go into this here. You have a card or something? I can even send you something before next Wednesday. As I said, pardon me, I am seeing this for the first time. I just got this from.
I know. And like I
So
say, for
basically,
me,
and I don't want that. I don't even want to start to, send you in a particular direction.
I know. And for me, I just like go about this cliche on and off my own here. Oh, let me write on top of it. For me, like I say, the whole thing with that Southwest assessment is that is like kicking. Because like most of where we are mainly based in London, our head of compliance and state compliance team is in London.
Wow.
But they regulated by the FC, and they're even more stringent.
Oh
my God, those people are something else. So we just trying to do this assignment for the commission because we do not want to be penalized.
No.
So So I tell her, besides doing that, I gotta do this because
Mhm.
I don't want to fail this course.
Yeah, indeed.
Because I am ready to the end. I done
You know,
passed the
yeah.
first part.
You're not done.
So
You're not done.
I tell her, for me, I just want to put my stuff together so when we are, and then I could just
Mhm.
go like a speed.
Certainly. Okay. What I would do, I'll put something together between now and weekend. Tomorrow's going to be hectic for me.
I
Tomorrow
know.
and Friday. But I'll send something together. Um, you have access, your email is on here?
Yeah, my email is on that. Because I emailed you before when I was travel last
Okay.
year
Okay.
for business when I was in the other place.
Okay. 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 Okay.
So now I'm just like I say,
Certainly.
just
I
this
will.
last thing right here, like I
Mhm.
say, and you know where they didn't do a test. I'm
Mhm.
grateful because
Mhm.
I know other person said that exam last year was just. They told me that was. They said y'all actually have it good
Mhm. Mhm.
because we
Mhm.
have a
Mhm.
better
It is a
advantage
blessing.
to knock these four questions out.
Certainly. Certainly.
So
Okay.
thank you so much.
I'll send something to you between now and weekend.
Okay, thank
Take
you
care,
so
yeah?
much.
Okay, have a good evening now.
Okay.
Okay. got the flash drive
Oh,
already.
alright.
Yes, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Okay.